Hi, Dan.
Hello, Henry. How are you?
Not too bad. A cold and miserable and grey morning in Washington, D.C.
Well, I am still living off the vestiges of my vacation tan. I went on a family vacation earlier this week. And Boston was snowing earlier today, but now appears to be warming up. So I'm in a very chipper mood.
I'm glad to hear it. I've heard of family vacations. I've heard of vacations, but we've two small kids, and in the last few years, it somehow hasn't seemed to happen.
Let me give you just one last thing on the family vacation. You'll eventually reach a point, we finally hit this, where you can go on a family vacation, and it's not just family vacation does not translate into just the kids enjoy it, but everyone enjoys it. That'll happen, I promise.
I hold out hope for that day. I hold out hope, and my wife too.
Yes.
So, a fun couple of days in international relations, I guess. A lot of stuff happening at the moment.
Yes, it certainly has not been boring. We have, I believe, today's announcement that the START treaty has been negotiated. There was the APAC conference this week. I'm sure there are a few other things, and it's all because of healthcare reform, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Clearly, healthcare reform. Everything can be traced back to healthcare reform.
I think that the entire arc of President Obama's foreign policy will be always traced back to the moment when healthcare reform. There's BHCR and PHCR. But in all seriousness, there's been when healthcare reform was passed, there were a number of blog posts, my own included. I think Andrew Sullivan weighed in on this, Gideon Rockman from the FT, my colleagues Steve Walton, Mark Lynch, you might know there are others, basically asking whether or not a domestic victory like healthcare reform can translate into any kind of foreign policy credibility or juice.
Yeah, and as I saw that debate, you're kind of in the middle towards the yes. It translates into a boost, but maybe not so much. Mm-hmm. Andrew Sullivan and Gideon Rockman were more out on the yes, this is a major transformative thing. And then we had skeptics, and I think your foreign policy colleague Stephen Walt being among them, saying this isn't going to count for very much in the international
right.
system.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, sort of one of the things that I was actually a little bit surprised by Walt saying that, because it seems to me, okay, well, let me throw out my theory and let me see what you think about it. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that this does have impact, but that the impact doesn't necessarily depend on the prestige all that much. Sure, prestige, as you say, is going to give a kind of modest bump, but where I think that there may be more significant impact is differentially between different countries, depending on exactly how they relate to the United States. And here I'm borrowing from Peter Katzenstein, who's a very well-known international relations professor to both of us, has this book about the American Imperium, where he basically argues that different states such as Germany and Japan, which relate to America, relate very differently because they relate through different kinds of domestic structure. And so part of what I wonder here is whether the impact is going to depend on what domestic structure you relate to the United States through. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, there are countries like China which relate primarily as sort of one power to another. They don't have all that much in the way of domestic sway on the Hill or what have you. On the other hand, there are countries such as Israel which rely sort of very heavily on the relationship with the executive, but also very heavily on the close relationship with many people on the Hill. And it might be there with countries like Israel that you might see the bigger change in relationships, because to the extent that Obama has managed to demonstrate his dominance with respect to the politicians on the Hill, you might expect that to have a greater transformative impact on, say, Israel's relationships with the U.S. than on China's relationships.
That's interesting. I mean, if memory serves, there's a story, and I can't remember who wrote it, about, in fact, one of the interesting things I think in China is, you're right, I think that the Chinese government doesn't have a powerful lobby. And in fact, if anything, their lobby is actually decreased. I think there were a couple stories in the FT last week about how China is trying to rally the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to pressure the Obama administration not to pressure China on the yuan. And the fact is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is growing increasingly frustrated with China, so they've got decreasing power. But what's interesting is that I think even a few Chinese writers actually said something to the effect of, wow, they actually did do health care. That's kind of impressive. Why doesn't our government provide a similar kind of social safety net? So that, one of the effects, I think, might be that it provokes domestic debate in other countries, even if the channels you're talking about aren't accessed. I think, with regard to Obama, I think there's three ways it matters, and it depends really on what theory you take into account. I think the short-term effect, and here I think the Netanyahu visit was particularly instructive, was it actually meant that Obama stayed around. I mean, remember, he was supposed to be in Indonesia at this point.
Yeah.
And he canceled it because he was, he had to stay back and hold healthcare reform. And he got beaten up, and I think a little bit fairly for this, because it is in some ways a snub. And I think the Indonesians will probably take it in stride, but still, you want to have some balance between international and domestic policy concerns. But I also think that the Israelis were caught flat-footed by this because, from what I read, I think there was a London Times story about this. It seems that they were convinced that the Obama administration was going to be so wrapped up in healthcare that they weren't going to bother pushing back against Netanyahu's visit to AIPAC and so forth. And so as a result, when he went to visit the president, and let's face it, that meeting didn't go terribly well from the perspective of the Netanyahu administration, I think they were a little bit surprised by that, and probably one of the reasons is that he could actually devote some time to it. So there is that short-term thing. I think the longer-term thing, you're right. I think it does depend to some extent on the way in which the other country views the U.S. domestic political process. And presumably, the better understanding the foreign country has of the U.S. domestic political process, one would expect them to be a little more impressed with what Obama managed to accomplish. Regardless of the merits, I don't want to really talk about the merits of the health care debate, politically this was a significant achievement. And one would assume that they would, and that was the point of my post, that one would assume they might actually respect Obama's sort of political acumen a little bit more. The thing I find interesting with Israel in particular, I don't know if you saw this, Jeff Goldberg had a post over at The Atlantic pointing out that one of the real problems that the Netanyahu administration might be having is that they're getting all their information about U.S. domestic policy through AIPAC, or an awful lot of it, and as a result they might have a somewhat cocooned view of the U.S. domestic political space at this point.
No, I think that's right, and I thought the Goldberg article was also very interesting in basically pushing the Israeli administration to start engaging with organizations like J Street, which is an organization which Goldberg himself has had a somewhat complicated relationship with, I think it would be fair to say. But so basically telling the Israelis this is time to spread their bets. I think that as you say, the short-term stuff was very interesting here, because what the fact that Obama was in town did was that it transformed what might otherwise have been something which was something that could be smoothed off by both parties. So in other words, the fact, Obama is clearly several thousand miles away, so he can't do much to meet you, into something that's been treated by the Israeli press as being a pretty direct snub. The fact that Obama did meet with Netanyahu, they did not have a joint press conference afterwards. There were a number of pretty tendentious comparisons made, sort of that this was. Hold on, I'll see if I can find the piece in the Financial Times, but basically the argument was that this was something like that he had been treated like Netanyahu had been treated like the president of Equatorial Guinea, or like the last Wazir of Senegal. Certainly comparisons which I think would have been a bit more sensitive in the U.S. context, but very clearly the Israelis saw this as being a dramatic snub, and this is something which could have been smoothed over if Obama had in fact been in a different place. And as you say, the other side of the Goldberg thing is that you don't see the same kinds of back-channel relationships that previous Israeli administrations have had with previous U.S. administrations, where they can negotiate things through high-level officials and informal contacts. This seems to just not be the case with the current Israeli administration, which is a problem for them, frankly.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. I mean, first, as much as, we're international relations scholars and we like to talk about systemic and structural factors, we should always acknowledge that personalities matter a little bit. And my understanding is that Obama and Netanyahu do not get along at all. They just don't. I mean, one of the constant refrains throughout all the press coverage, regardless of the position, was the utter lack of trust between these two people. And that probably, plays a large role. On the back channel issue, I mean, the problem here is that the Israeli back channel would have been Joe Biden. Biden, as vice president, was, I think, widely perceived to be one of the more pro-Israel, more sort of strongest friends of Israel in the administration. And, however the Israelis want to explain this, the fact is that Biden did get snubbed, on the VP trip. It was politically embarrassing for him. So, and I would even go further than you. I think the White House was very clear in trying to do everything possible to make it clear that they were not happy with Netanyahu, short of having, that photo op that the Israeli Foreign Ministry did with the Turkish ambassador, where they had like the different, heights. I mean, they not just a lack of a press conference, no joint statement, no photo op whatsoever. And the press leaks indicate that Obama said, "I'm going to have dinner with my family. You guys work this out amongst yourselves, and maybe we can talk later." It was very clear he was trying to put pressure on Netanyahu. I think the interesting question is whether or not Netanyahu is going to be able to budge at all. I mean, he's got severe domestic political constraints as well. I mean, this isn't just about, we had talked about how Israel's had a number of foreign policy flaps over the last, 3 months or so. And, to be fair, not all of this is Netanyahu's fault. I mean, it is in the sense of he chose his coalition partners, but he's got a very bulky coalition, and he's, among other things, he's tethered to these very strong extreme settler, right-wing parties. And so it's not clear that he's going to be able to budge unless he's willing to see his government fall.
Well, this is, of course, the interesting question which lies behind, there have been some suggestions that the Obama government is tacitly trying to push Netanyahu to dump some of the right-wing parties in favor of an alliance with the more centrist types, in the hope that they might be able to do a deal. But I think I think that's a reasonably good analysis, and here keeping well away from the kinds of analysis of is Israel right or wrong, which I'm sure is going to inflame the comment section regardless of what we talk about. There is even if whichever which way you look at it, Israel is playing its international cards very badly at the moment, and it's because it's inwardly focused. It's because domestic coalition politics dominate. Because you have people like Avigdor Lieberman as a foreign policy minister, who is I don't think would be on anybody's number one list for politicians who are likely to adeptly cut a fine figure on the international stage, and you get stuff like the Turkish thing, which was just to explain for our viewers who may not be familiar with this. This was a meeting which was organised where the Turkish representative was deliberately sat down on a seat which was lower and flatter and whatever than the Israeli representative, and then this was announced to the world by the press spokesperson for the foreign ministry. And so this kind of direct and deliberate humiliation by and large doesn't work, and this is something that I think international relations people are used to saying they tend not to focus on personal relations as much as they perhaps should, but they also tend not to focus on the ways in which the niceties of diplomacy can have some pretty important consequences, and people who can manipulate that language well tend to do reasonably well as a result. People who tend not to do so well at that can have very, very serious problems as a result, and I think Israel is in that situation.
Yeah, I would add two things on this. First, what I love was that the actual source of that Israeli-Turkish dispute was, I believe, the Turkish television program that I don't know if it was government sponsored or not, but basically the television program was the Turkish equivalent of 24, and shockingly, it had the Mossad as the sort of evil actor. But I'm trying to imagine a U.S. ambassador being brought to task because of some awful stereotype on 24, for example. And it does sort of highlight the absurdity of this. Also, you have to give the Israelis credit. They really have engaged in real skill by managing to make people feel sympathy for the Turks on this, because the Turks themselves have had their own foreign policy flubs, over the last couple of months, particularly the way in which the president has handled the Armenian genocide resolution in Congress. Which, you can argue that might not, again, this might have been, one of those things where diplomatic niceties should have been recognized. But I believe the Turkish response by the PM was, I will expel all the Armenians, which really does kind of drive home the point that this isn't going to, it was not the brightest of moves. Yes, exactly. It was not the brightest of moves. I mean, beyond this, the Israel question, do you think there's any other, sort of dimension on which leaders are going to give Obama, more credit because he got healthcare reform? Or, I mean, this is where I tend to side more on the Steve Walt side. I think in the long run, this is just going to dissipate in terms of its effect.
My guess is how can I put it? So I would have a slightly stronger view, but only a very slightly stronger view, which is that you don't want to be perceived as being a weak and a beset domestic leader on the international stage, because that makes people take you less seriously. My suspicion is this will make Obama appear not to be weak, so that some of the so that he will be able to get more leverage, certainly, than if he had lost the vote. But as to whether this translates into a substantial positive push above and beyond what the U.S. normally gets, that I would be pretty skeptical about.
I think the one thing I would add is that, and again, this is the way in which, someone talked about how, the way in which, let's face it, we interpret a lot of politics through narratives, and I think the combination of healthcare reform plus the START treaty that was announced today, the one way in which you can tie both of these things together was these were both things that if you looked at it a year ago and sort of looked at the constellation of interests involved, you would have predicted, okay, these things will eventually get through. Because, after all, the Democrats did control both houses of Congress, and it was in both the U.S. and Russian interest to negotiate a START treaty. But they both took a lot longer, I think, than policy activists would have liked on both sides. And I think the one argument that Obama might be able to make after this is just to ask for patience on a variety of other, intractable policy issues that are going to take a long time, because Obama can now say, look, you guys doubted me before, but we got health care reform done. We got the START treaty, signed. If nothing else, what it might do is not so much change policy preferences, but there might be a little more credibility given to Obama in terms of the process by which he does these things.
So this is a Mark Lynch argument, effectively, that this will, so that there's more credibility to the position that, in fact, when Obama is doing this very long, painstaking stuff, that it does pay off in the longer term, rather than ending up as nothing.
Right, except, of course, this is always frustrating right until after, of course, you eventually have to get the results. So, I mean, this buys him some time. I don't think it buys him much else.
Yeah, no, that all sounds pretty plausible to me. Mm-hmm. Now, on to, I guess, maybe should we talk about the Frumble in the jungle, David Frum's resignation under unexpected circumstances from the American Enterprise Institute?
Yes, and again, Henry, I got to give you credit. Frumble in the jungle is, you really do need to copyright that immediately after this Blogging Heads. Again, the background, David Frum, basically, I think since, Obama's election, has tried to talk about, developing an alternative opposition, based in the GOP, but not based on this sort of populist, Sarah Palin / Glenn Beck / Rush Limbaugh approach to politics. And after health care reform was passed, Frum posted something on his blog basically implying, man, did the GOP screw up, because they could have actually influenced aspects of health care reform, gotten a little more on cost containment and so forth, but by, maintaining a unified bloc, they really managed to screw things up. And this was linked to by just about everyone slightly left of center in the blogosphere. As an example of, see, some Republicans are now beginning to realize they might have screwed up. And this all leads to, this was earlier in the week, and then the Wall Street Journal, I believe, published an editorial or an op-ed, I'm not entirely sure, attacking Frum is basically, earning strange new respect from liberal quarters. And then this all leads up to yesterday, where after apparently a lunch with AEI's Arthur Brooks, Frum made it very clear that he was canned.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, let me just give sort of my perspective, and here clearly I'm a lefty.
And you know David, right? I mean, I've never met him, but you've actually interacted with him. Is this correct?
Not as such. I think we had a kind of intemperate interaction as a result of a Blogging Heads, where he basically suggested to Mark Schmidt that he was following a Charles Lindbergh approach in his unwillingness to get involved in various public not public celebrations, but public events, obviously connected with September 11th. So we had I kind of had a testy discussion about this, which I think David Frum responded to in the comment sections. That's about as far as our personal interactions go. Okay. My personal take on him is, on the one hand, I think some of his stuff strikes me as flat out crazy. This is in particular the famous End to Evil book that he co-wrote with what's his name? Some of his
Richard
stuff,
Pearl.
Richard Pearl, indeed, the Prince of Darkness. Some of his stuff, sort of most of what he has to say, I find I don't agree with, but he strikes me as being an almost painfully honest person. So if he's somebody who is, he's not a strategist, he's not a hack, he's somebody who believes what he believes and is prepared to say what he wants to say. And I think it's a real problem for the American Enterprise Institute and for the institutionalized right if they're not able to tolerate people like that as being useful and important critical voices. I think it's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, obviously, one of the things that everyone's debating about today is why actually Frum was fired, and he was being very elliptical, I think, in his comments. Although I believe he told Mike Allen at Politico that it was implied that it wasn't so much AEI that wanted to fire him, but rather the people who funded AEI were not huge fans, and that they got to Brooks, and then as a result that happened. On the one hand, I certainly agree that it's always disturbing when you see this sort of thing because you begin to wonder if it's an example of groupthink. On the other hand, I mean, let's be honest, think tanks are not exactly like universities in that respect. It's not terribly surprising that you would have conservative boosters be upset with someone based in a conservative think tank for espousing views that might have been somehow seen as harm the conservative movement. I think in some ways that the one, but on the other hand, I agree with you. I think it's problematic that in some ways that AEI translates its fortunes only and exclusively into success for the GOP. And I think that the most fascinating and disturbing thing was something that Bruce Bartley relayed on his blog, which was that Frum told him apparently that that the reason that AEI, healthcare experts had been completely silent in the press is because most AEI healthcare experts actually supported the healthcare reform because they equated Obamacare with essentially something that Mitt Romney had done in the state of Massachusetts. And it was the case that AEI didn't want that out there for a variety of reasons. So I will say that it becomes disturbing if a think tank becomes so hitched to one party that it essentially becomes a house party organ rather than an organ like, let's say, Cato, which you can. I'm sure you don't agree with a lot that Cato puts forward, but I don't think you can accuse Cato of being hostage to the Republican Party.
No, Cato clearly does maintain a kind of an arm's length relationship with the Republican Party.
Right.
I think there are a couple of things, and as you say, in the end of the day, think tanks, so they very clearly have partisan affiliations of one sort or another.
Most of them do. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do. Yeah,
but a lot of them. The ones we're talking about, AEI, on the other side, the
Center for American Progress,
and all of those. And so this is something which has become more and more apparent over the decades. Right. Originally, because of the tax rules, these think tanks were very, very reluctant to get involved too directly in policy debates. Now they become more and more and more. So as long as they don't directly endorse candidates, I think they can get away with pretty well most anything they want to do. Mm-hmm. And so there is, that's something which is inevitable. But I guess, sort of my query is more about the state of debate in the Republican Party, because I think about, who I think are the real interesting conservative intellectuals. So if Frum, I think, is very, very interesting. His book, Dead Right, is it's a fascinating book, whether you agree with it or you disagree with it. It also gives me the sense of somebody who's in some ways almost happier being a voice crying out in the wilderness than somebody who's part of a concerted and successful movement. But it's a very smart, very telling analysis of what the Republicans were doing then. You've got Bruce Bartlett, who similarly was forced out of a job a few years ago for
at the National Center for Policy Analysis.
Exactly, for saying things that he didn't want to say. And you've got people like Jonathan Rauch, who's a libertarian with some sort of mild conservative tendencies. The point is that these are the smartest people out there, and they're in a different league of smartness from, say, Jonah Goldberg or Mark Thiessen, who Frum perhaps jokingly said in a tweet were sort of going to be hired by the AEI. None of them have positions which are sort of positions with any of the main right-wing think tanks, and I think there's a reason for that.
No, sorry, do you want to continue? Or?
No, I just say, and I think it's a problem, because what you want in these think tanks, you want two things. If you're a smart Republican or a smart Democrat, one, you want people who are going to repeat your points and give you talking points and all of that, which think tanks on both sides of the spectrum fulfill admirably as a role. But the second is that you want to have actual debate happening and people raising critical voices, because that's where you find sort of new stuff that you wouldn't have thought about before. That's where policy positions, which once seemed smart and good positions, get sort of torn down and replaced with new ones. And here, I think, if the right has a real deficit here, that's going to be a problem over the next couple of decades, and not only a problem for the right, but for American democracy.
Well, I mean, let me put it. I mean, I don't disagree necessarily with your point about Republican elections. I would add Rehan Salam to that group, and also maybe
I thought about him too, but he's at New America Foundation,
right,
which I think is strongly, it's definitely to the left of center.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. This depends on the I, on the one hand, completely agree that you want to have intellectual ferment, particularly for the party out of power. Presumably what should happen is that if a party loses political power, there should be ideological ferment where they try to think, well, what happened? What did we do wrong? What's the way in which we can, get back into power? And presumably what are the ideas that we can put forward that'll potentially, lead to a revival? And here you can actually argue, perhaps, that Obama's first year, oddly enough, screwed over the Republicans just as much as it cost him popularity, which is as his popularity ratings began to decline, and as you saw this Tea Party movement grow up, I think most expectations. I remember I did a Blogging Heads with Frum right after Obama became president, and we both had agreed at that point. You know what? It's going to take the Republicans probably one more election cycle where they get pasted to realize they're really going to need to recast their ideas. And let's face it, whatever you think about, the midterms, they're probably not going to get pasted. They might do less. I think oddly enough, they might not do as well as they had hoped. Let's say, particularly after Scott Brown's victory. But I'm not sure they're going to do. They're not going to do badly. And so, from the party's perspective, I can see why, if they feel like they can ride the Tea Party movement and actually do relatively well, they will kick out people like Frum, because from the party's perspective, their goal is to win votes. And is to win seats. So, if people like Frum make it difficult for them to do that, then I understand from their perspective. But that said, I agree with you that what you want is a split between what the GOP does and what conservatives do. Much in the same way that presumably you would want a similar split between what the Democratic Party does and what progressives do. I think oddly enough, this is one area where progressives might do better because of their general perceived lack of organization and sense of alienation. So, you'll always have people on the left that never entirely feel like they're one with the Democrats. So they can actually, try to come up with new ideas. I'm not sure if conservatives are as adept at doing that. And it's going to be an interesting question over time whether they can adapt to that sort of role. So, I mean, from a partisan perspective, I can't blame the GOP for riding the Tea Party movement, because let's face it, they're doing better as a result of that. I mean, I don't think Scott Brown wins without the Tea Party movement, and I certainly don't think they would necessarily do as well coming up in the midterms. Although I don't know if you saw this New York Times story today about Bob Bennett from Utah.
No, I didn't.
It's about basically whether the Tea Partiers are actually going to force Bennett off, not just the general, but actually the Republican primary. The Utah primary system is a very arcane kind of caucus setup, and there's a lot of hostility to Bennett because he voted for TARP back in fall 2008. Now, I've actually met Bob Bennett a couple times. He's he's A, really conservative, but B, he's really, really smart. And so if he's forced out, then there's a way in which I agree that this sort of Tea Party thing might wind up being self-defeating. And you're right, I think to some extent, the other thing that's going on here is this sort of populist, the fact that much of the sort of ferment on the GOP side is a very populist ferment. And the one thing Frum is absolutely not is a populist.
Absolutely. He's an aristocrat, and I think...
No, he's a complete aristocrat. I mean, he opposed Harriet Miers, I remember, back in 2006, because, let's face it, she wasn't, perceived as terribly bright. And that's why he took on Palin, in 2008 and so forth. And so, one of the questions is, can conservative intellectuals talk about ideas and at the same time coexist with this sort of populist backlash? Or are there ways in which conservative intellectuals can actually take the populist backlash and convert it into something that is intellectually defendable or defensible, if that makes any sense?
It's an interesting question. I think it's a tough one. I guess my instinct is probably not. It's just because so it seems to me that the Tea Party is the Tea Party crowd it's like riding a tiger. There was another interesting article, I can't remember where recently, maybe it was Jonathan Chait, talking about how what the Tea Party have been trying to do, and what Dick Armey in particular has been trying to do, is trying to sort of focus all of the attention on healthcare and on the financial reforms, and away from stuff like immigration reform. Immigration reform in particular, where so this is something which clearly a lot of Tea Partiers are not likely to be very enthusiastic about waves of immigrants speaking different languages, not being white and whatever, and that this this populism could go in a very tricky and problematic direction. And so I guess the interesting question is twofold. As you say, first it's can the intellectuals, who have typically, had, I think, an amiable contempt towards the religious right in particular, seeing them as being the shock troops in a certain sense, can they come to an accommodation with the populists of the Tea Party? And secondly, can the Republican Party construct a long-term coalition which includes the Tea Party and a majority of the Democratic electorate? And that's, when and if the Tea Party stuff starts getting translated into policy, that's going to be very interesting to see, because Scott Brown is a moderate Republican. He is not a Tea Party type of person. Whether he is, if he wants to get re-elected, he cannot be a Tea Party type person. So can the Tea Party people be brought into the tent? I'd have my doubts.
I don't know. I mean, I'll sound a more optimistic note on two things. First, you can argue that the very fact that the Tea Party movement supported Scott Brown was an indication of political savvy, because I mean they were, the activists who got involved, I don't think were that, they weren't stupid. They actually recognized that a lot of what Scott Brown was saying and what his prior record was suggested that he was a moderate. So I mean they were clearly doing this to hurt Obama rather than get one of their own elected. I think the second thing is, the real question is are there key issues around which the Tea Party movement can coalesce such that those are the ones they wind up really pushing forward, as opposed to sort of more broader-based, sort of general ressentiment against the federal government or whatever, however you want to put it. I mean, it strikes me, for example, that if you could actually get the Tea Party movement to deal with something like, let's say, ballooning federal debt. Now, I'm not sure you can actually make this case, but I could see Tea Partiers being upset about that. Because let's face it, I think your average Tea Partier was a Ron Paul voter in 2008. And, Ron Paul certainly doesn't like the Fed constantly printing dollars. So if you could actually get, tie the Tea Party resentment towards things like deficit reduction and or fiscal rectitude, then that might be a way in which you can cobble together a majority, and a majority that would actually, embrace moderate Democrats. But I grant you that's going to be a tricky needle to thread.
So Pete Peterson and the Tea Party are separated at birth. It'll be interesting to see if it sounds.
I got to say, Pete Peterson and the Tea Partiers released an awesome first album, I remember. And I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. But no, I agree. It might not be possible, but I really do. Let me put it this way: I think you can actually argue that debt, ballooning debt is actually a way in which you can deal with Tea Party resentment against the federal government, and argue that the federal government should be living within its means, which is certainly something that would resonate with Tea Party voters.
Albeit not with the Republican Party based on the 2000-2008 record of spending.
No, but I mean, in some ways, that's been the hostility. I mean, that was one of the ways in which CPAC is, for example, not been in love with the Bush administration. Was not in love with the Bush administration. But we'll see going forward if that's possible.
Yeah. Well, I guess another organization where there's forces of populism versus the elite, but in a very different sense, is the Roman Catholic Church.
Yes.
This is something you've been following?
I have to admit, this is one of these awful confessions. I don't normally pay attention to Catholic Church as a Jew. It's not really my. It's not the first thing I've turned to. My understanding is there's been a little bit of spot of unpleasantness involving various child abuse and sexual molestation charges across Europe now, and that apparently the Pope Benedict. Which number is Pope Benedict now?
God help me if I can remember, and I'm supposed to be at least nominally Catholic.
I was saying you're nominally Roman Catholic, but Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, when he was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger or Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, I never know how it goes. Apparently, the area that he oversees, he demonstrated some lax oversight over one of these priests. I assume you have been following this.
Yeah, I have been following it. So if you were a Catholic, your confession would earn you 10 Hail Marys, 10 Our Fathers, and you sort of a period of penitence from the priest in the confessional. But I think there is an interesting and more general and less Catholic story here, and I think it's a story about what happens with organizations when things have gone very, very badly wrong.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear things did go very badly wrong, and not only badly wrong, but systematically wrong. That the entire system of the Catholic Church was basically sort of centered around trying to hush up incidents of child abuse, trying to get the priests cured in various ways, and then sent back out very frequently to new parishional duties, sometimes under circumstances which would make it less likely that they would come into contact with kids in the future, sometimes not so much. And so this is, the Catholic Church has been a law unto itself for centuries, and it has always had this aspect, I think, to it, and also an aspect of very strong hierarchy. But then the question is, what happens when this stuff begins to start crumbling, as I think it has very much in Ireland. A lot of this was precipitated by a major report which was released about a month ago into pretty systematic abuse which was happening within Ireland over a period of decades. The archbishops were summoned to Rome to get ticked off by the Pope. The Pope then issued a letter last week, which was intended to admonish the Irish Church for what had happened, but also to demonstrate to people elsewhere that the sort of Catholic Church was taking this stuff seriously. And in addition, the Pope announced that he was going to have what's called an apostolic visitation, which is basically sending in the inquisitors to find out what has happened and to correct stuff in the Irish Catholic Church.
Okay, I have to interrupt here. This is again how Jews think about this. What you just described, all I'm now flashing to is the musical sequence in History of the World Part 1, where Mel Brooks does an Esther Williams-style explanation of what the Spanish Inquisition was like.
Okay, sadly I haven't seen that movie since I was about 10 years old.
Whoever is in charge of the clips on the right, please put that YouTube clip up. So go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so anyway, so the bottom line here is the Catholic Church has been trying to deal with this stuff internally by reinforcing its traditional lines of authority. So the Pope admonishing bishops, sending out sort of commissions of inquiry into what's happening, reassuring people that this is all going to work out well. But it's not working. It's very clearly not working. There are a lot of really, really pissed off Catholics, lay parishioners. If you listen to the radio in Ireland, you just hear lots and lots of people calling in outrage. And Ireland was a country where a decade ago or so you had something like 85% of people attending Mass on a weekly basis. So this is, if you wanted to find a strong Catholic country, this is about as strong as you could possibly find. So here I think it's an interesting organizational question that traditionally, you would expect an organization like this, where there's systematic stuff happening, you would expect the person at the top of that organization, especially if they had been to some degree involved in the cover-up, to resign. This is not something which currently is on the agenda. Popes can resign. They have resigned in the past.
Have they?
Yeah, they have.
I did not know this. This is fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, one of them I think was rather forcibly resigned and then ended up being starved to death on an island. This was during the period of the Byzantine Schism, as I recall. I did a little bit of research on this a couple of days ago.
Well, but this raises when was what was the most recent pope to resign? I mean, you're talking about more than a millennia ago.
The most recent pope I think was sometime in the late Middle Ages, sometime around in the 1400s, as I recall. But I've got to confess, my research into this consisted of 20 minutes googling. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
So I mean, and the other problem, of course, with all of this, as you point out, is that it's not just that this pope has tried to reassert traditional lines of authority. This pope might be the most traditional pope we've had, and I mean, this pope makes John Paul II look positively Unitarian almost. But so I mean, there's been controversy, already even before this about whether or not Pope Benedict had been conceived as sort of, too authoritarian, for lack of a better way of putting it. One of the things I keep wondering is, the U.S. Catholic Church had to deal with this over a decade ago when there were a rash of child abuse scandals. And one of the things I keep wondering is that while certainly in the U.S. case, again, you saw similar kinds of attempts to cover this up, but at the same time, eventually it all came out in the wash. And I do have to wonder to what extent this varies from country to country based upon the amount of religious competition they see. So in other words, the Catholic Church in the United States has adapted somewhat to both the changes in American society and the fact that compared to Pentecostal and evangelical denominations, it was beginning to lose parishioners, and so has had to, I would imagine, adapt somewhat to this. Whereas in Europe, most the countries that are considered Catholic, the Catholic Church almost has a monopoly on religious authority in these countries. Could it be that they're just not as they're not as efficient, I guess would be the way to put it.
I'd actually, I'm not so sure that explanation works for a couple of reasons. First, so where it does work is that the Catholic Church, especially in continental Europe, has secure lines of funding, which it does not have in the US. That is to say, if you register as being a Catholic in Germany, you pay a certain percentage of your income each year to through the federal taxation system, effectively, to maintain the church and to maintain church institutions. So that gives it a kind of a cushion that it can use. But at the same time, you've got to remember that in Europe, church attendance is extremely low as compared to the US. Now,
that's fair.
The statistics on this, I understand, are kind of dubious and exaggerate the differences, but nonetheless, there are some very real differences, and the Catholic Church does see itself in the end as being in the business of saving souls, and if it even if it maintains its institutional structures, but has a church attendance of 10 to 12% of nominal Catholics, this is not a situation that it's going to be especially happy with. I think that the American story, interestingly, has maybe more to do with alternative means of organizing within civil society in the 18th.
Yeah,
it's kind of a
that's a fair
Tocquevillian
point.
story. That you have these groups setting up to protest what's happening. They get absolutely frozen out by the Catholic Church, which refuses to extend them any recognition whatsoever, until effectively it's forced to do so because these groups have managed to organize independently. You haven't seen that as much or to as great an extent in other countries, but then again the shock hasn't penetrated in the same way yet in these other countries as it has in the US. But I guess in the end, the problem the Catholic Church faces, this is a classic text that we're both familiar with, Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which is one of the classics of, I don't know what you call it, political science or economics or whatever. And
just call it social science, yeah.
Yeah, social science. And so it effectively suggests that, when you've got an organization, the organization may change in response to exit, that is when people start leaving. It may change in response to voice, that is when people are engaged in discussion, sort of an argument within it, or it may rely in the end on loyalty. And the Catholic Church, I think it's facing a radical threat of exit, but that doesn't seem to be changing its policies very much in this set of issues. It certainly isn't allowing very much in the way of voice. So I think it's going to be left to rely on loyalty on these people who are effectively so loyal to the Catholic Church that they will stick to it through thick and thin, which I suspect is a relatively small percentage of the current congregation, certainly in Ireland, and I would guess in Catholic parts of Germany and other places as well.
Well, again, I'm asking this question. This is partly born out of ignorance. I see the odds of Benedict, resigning about as equal to, the Ayatollah Khamenei leaving, his position as supreme leader in Iran, which is you can't admit infallibility in either of these situations because that kind of undercuts the whole legitimacy of the organization. In the case of the Catholic Church, though, I guess the other question I would have is, to what extent does the source of the Church's strength has it shifted from Europe, and for that matter from the developed world, to the developing world? And to what extent are you likely to see scandals emerge there?
That's a very interesting question to which I have no good answer. The short answer is yes. The developing world sees a lot of religious competition against evangelicals who are seeking to convert as well, but certainly also sees a sort of much higher rates of ordination, for example, of priests and of other celibate officers of the church in a certain sense. As to what the sort of likelihood of abuse is there, I'm not sure. I do know that in certain circumstances, the Catholic Church has been prepared to turn a blind eye to priests having heterosexual relationships that are relatively stable and straightforward. So there is a kind of on the one hand, a nod and a wink sometimes to heterosexual relationships between priests and women. On the other hand, a sort of much more strident, even than in the developed world, a much more strident opposition to homosexuality and to gay priests and to indeed gay parishioners. A lot of sort of pent up homophobia there. So. But as to how the scandal is playing out over there, frankly, I simply don't know. I've been following the European debate. I've been following the US debate. I've no idea how it's playing out, for example, in the countries of sub-Saharan Africa.
Assuming, though, that Benedict doesn't resign, I mean, what do you think the fallout will be from the Catholic Church?
I think it's going to be a very, very tough time, and I think you've identified the problem, which is that effectively, typically in an organizations respond by sort of having the CEO or the chief officer take the fall in a certain sense, or else they have some relatively easy sort of means of they have regular elections whereby a disgraced leader, George W. Bush possibly being an example of this, can sort of exit the scene relatively gracefully and relatively straightforwardly. The Catholic Church simply doesn't have that. Pope Benedict is 82, so he is an old man, but he seems to be relatively healthy, so he could still go on for a number of years, and he almost certainly has no intention whatsoever of resigning. But it presents a real problem, because if he is directly identified with the problem, and there's some evidence that at least as a bishop and as a Vatican official, he turned a blind eye to some of this stuff and was directly involved in implementing some of the more dubious policies, perhaps directly involved in cases involving a couple of priests. This is yet to be established. Then that presents a real problem for the Catholic Church. So if you do not want to have somebody who's condoned child abuse and sought to hush it up as being effectively your chief executive officer, but if you don't have a very good way to get that person to resign, then you're stuck in a somewhat impossible organizational bind.
Well, speaking of organizational difficulties in Eurocentric institutions, that had to have been the smoothest segue ever. Yesterday, the European Council of Ministers, I believe, also met to discuss the financial difficulties that Greece has had, and they reached some kind of accommodation, I believe, to set up an emergency financing facility should Greece be unable to roll over its current debt. How would you interpret the lay of the land here, Henry?
Okay, well, this is a complicated story, so I'll try to simplify as quickly as possible, as much as possible. Basically, the problem here is it has to do with the economic and monetary union and the fact that all of these countries share a single currency, the euro. And so what's happened is that Greece has gotten into a lot of trouble, and it turns out that so this potentially has long-term consequences for the stability of the euro, especially if larger countries than Greece were to similarly sort of get into fiscal difficulties. But because the euro is effectively involves a number of different states which are bound together in the European Union but are not within a single federal system, there aren't any of the kinds of stabilizers that you get in federal systems such as the German system or the US system, where transfers of one sort or another between states can help to some degree to cushion the effects, the effects of locally asymmetric shocks. And so you've had a big argument happening between, on the one hand, Germany, which is effectively the big state, which is presumably the state that would help bail out, but that has a very, very strong aversion to bailing out other countries, not only for the obvious reasons of it has to pay money, but also for a variety of political reasons, and other countries, including in particular France, which would prefer to see some degree of a stronger economic government and fiscal transfer mechanisms being introduced to make the European Union, in a certain sense, more like a federal system and more like actually a single economy, a single nation state. So they reached an accommodation yesterday, which is frankly a little bit of a fudge. On the one hand, it says that Germany and other countries will provide bilateral loans to Greece if Greece really needs them, and it softens slightly the conditions under which they will provide those loans, while making it clear that those loans are only sort of intended as a resort if absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. It also brings in the International Monetary Fund to help, enforce some discipline on Greece. So these are things that I think Germany wanted to see. It wanted to see very strong conditions on any loans. It wanted to see the IMF being introduced as a disciplinary force, or else alternatively European Monetary Fund being introduced as a disciplinary force. On the other hand, the French have managed to extract a concession that the Germans are now talking about some form of European government, is what it's called in French, but through a kind of ambiguity in translation, they've talked about this as European governance when they talk about it in English. So there's a fudge there. But the interesting question for me is what happens to the European government, European governance angle of this. The French clearly wanted to make this into something which will involve some supervision of countries which are going to get into trouble, but also greater possibilities for fiscal policy, both within member states and perhaps for fiscal transfers across states in times of difficulty. The Germans are steadfastly resisting, so it's a fudge, but it's a fudge that could lead to some significant new integration in the European Union.
Well, I mean, Henry, you're much more of an EU expert or European expert than I am. So, I mean, I'm going to phrase these in the form of questions, based on watching. The first question I have is, how has Germany managed to escape this sort of opprobrium that, let's say, a country like China has faced? China's caught a lot of hell from a lot of different countries, and particularly in the United States, for basically, relying heavily on exports to fuel its recovery through an undervalued currency, and as a result, the claim is that it's sort of sucking away. People like Paul Krugman and others have said that it's basically acting as a vacuum cleaner for jobs that are lost in the United States. What strikes me is that Germany, in some ways, seems equally guilty of this, in that they've refrained from sort of even the large-scale fiscal stimulus that China engaged in following the Great Recession. They basically disdained, I think, what Pierre Steinbrück called the crass Keynesianism that was in response to the recession, and that as a result, German exports have done remarkably well. Oddly enough, I think they've profited a little bit from the tumble that the euro has taken as a result of Greece's crisis, because it improves their exports. But to what extent is Germany seen as a responsible actor? I mean, there's no doubt they're the most powerful actor, but to what extent is Germany seen as the responsible actor from the rest of the European Union?
Well, this is again something which I think the French talk of economic government is supposed to get at. The French foreign minister very, very delicately raised the issue. Wouldn't it be nice if Germany started to stimulate its own demand a little bit as well, which was met with furious indignation from German politicians. But I think that the answer to your question is pretty straightforward. This is an issue. It very clearly is an issue that people are talking about and people are thinking about. Governments within Europe are tiptoeing around it very delicately, because Germany is the biggest country in the club, and because the European Union is a club. Whereas China, of course, its relations with the US are much more at arm's length in a certain sense, and that clearly they're very bound together in economic terms, but not so much in terms of political structures. We do see a debate beginning. Martin Wolf, who is, I think, very, very prominently placed in debates about the European economy, has written a couple of pieces which basically talk directly and make that direct comparison between Germany and China's role. But we haven't seen anything in the way of very strong pushback from other countries. This is something that may start to arise, though, if the problem continues. Wolf, I think, makes a very, very good case that simply, what Germany wants to do is unsustainable, which is that Germany wants, on the one hand, to be sort of able to sort of have relatively depressed demand and a strong export-based economy itself.
Right.
It also wants to export a similar kind of system, sort of which emphasizes high savings and all of those things to the rest of the European Union, but demand has to come from somewhere, and the imbalance has to be resolved somehow, and Germany simply can't have its cake and eat it at the same time. I think, as far as, I'm not a macroeconomist, but Wolf's argument seems to me to be a strong one and a sound one. Where the political pressure is going to come from, how that political pressure is going to manifest itself, that I frankly don't know.
I mean, the other thing is that, I mean, in some ways, this is becoming almost periodic with the European Union. And on the one hand, you do see this sort of slow agglomeration of strength, within European governance structures. But about every 4 or 5 years or so, there's some sort of crisis that actually causes the euro to fall, either because the referendum fails or because of the crisis right now. The thing I keep wondering about also is, to what extent is Greece the tip of the iceberg? I don't know if you've been reading the Reinhardt and Rogoff book. This time it's different, but
I have it on my shelf, but I've yet to.
I'm finally reading it, and it's very interesting and very good and very accessible. And I'll just plug it for Blogging Heads readers. But one of the things that they make very clear is that when you have these kinds of financial crises, they do tend to follow a pattern, which is, after you have the fallen asset prices or in banking runs, inevitably what happens is you have a crisis in terms of government financing. That debt as a percentage of GDP by the government begins to explode, and eventually you have potentially runs on currencies. So one would assume that the rest of these governments, particularly I think Portugal and Italy are the ones that are sort of thought to be next in the queue, have pretty high debt to GDP ratios, and they're only going to go up more potentially. To what extent is Greece just sort of the canary in the coal mine, or do you think they can, that the measures taken can actually, produce a firebreak, as it were?
A lot of this depends on market. So on two things: market confidence and the ability to establish a somewhat stronger fiscal position, and finally, so just the fact that European economies are not especially competitive at the moment. But actually, I see the source of pressure. That's an interesting source of short-term pressure. I think that the more systemic institutional pressure comes from another great book, Barry Eichengreen's book, looking at the gold standard, and effectively, what you saw back in the era of the gold standard was a system which privileged sort of maintaining stable fixed exchange rates, and which was only maintainable in a certain sense because democracy was very badly underdeveloped in the countries which were doing this at the time, so that every time that there was a crisis, basically the adjustment had to be borne by the workers, borne by the less prosperous elements in society. And so Eichengreen basically argues that this kind of sort of very tough system is really only maintainable in an era where you don't have very much in the way of democracy. What I think we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing something very similar, which is that the straitjacket that the economic and monetary union poses for its countries is something which is it's basically as another Financial Times columnist, Wolfgang Munkau, argued a few days ago. It's basically a glorified fixed exchange rate system, and it's hurting like hell for a lot of countries. The adjustment is being borne by workers in countries such as Ireland, such as Spain, is going to be borne tenfold in countries such as Greece. The interesting question for me is, can this be maintained over the longer term as a political institution? And frankly, I'm a little skeptical. I think that the European Union does have to move to a much more stronger political union, which would involve some degree of fiscal transfers to countries suffering from asymmetric shocks. Whether or not Germany likes it or doesn't like it, or else Germany is going to have to abandon this ambition of setting itself at the heart of Europe and being the centre of this economic and monetary union. I simply don't see any way that the political circle can be squared over the longer term.
Well, squaring our conversation, let me ask you one last hypothetical. that is one possible route in which the European Union can go, is to realize, look, we can't constantly have a unified, fixed exchange rate monetary system while having such a radically decentralized fiscal system. So as a result, one response might be we're going to have a more coordinated fiscal setup where, as you say, there can be sufficient amount of transfers such that governments that experience recessions can actually have some sort of stabilizers kick in. If this happens, however, there's a fair amount of resentment also against the European Union within Europe because of the anti-democratic nature of the EU. To what extent would the likelihood be that there be a European equivalent of the Tea Party movement? Or does the European equivalent of the Tea Party movement look a lot uglier?
That would be one big worry, which is that there's a lot of ugly racist resentment bubbling up in Europe. I think much more than in the US, especially against the large Muslim minorities in a number of European countries. And I don't think it's entirely dissimilar to the kinds of resentments that were expressed against Jews in the 1920s, 1930s. You could see you could see populism developing in some extremely nasty directions in Europe. I hope to hell that doesn't happen, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Okay, well, with that ominous note, I think we need to sign off and get back to our day jobs. But Henry, it's always been a pleasure.
And great to talk to you as well, Dan.
All right, take care.
You too.